Oh yeah, perfect. So what I want to talk about is practical lessons from building dashboards with Angular. Like I say, it's going to be pretty down to earth. Lots of code examples. So I'm not going to amaze you with some abstract, cool new stuff. This is going to be a quite practical and down to earth presentation. So without further ado, slide about me, some facts about me. I do like Angular a lot. I like React as well. I'm actually really adore Vue.js. Work mainly with JavaScript and TypeScript these days. Used to do PHP long time ago. And I also like Rust and Haskell. And some other of my life and work facts. And yeah, indeed, I work for passionate people. Really happy to work for this great company. So I'm going to jump right next to agenda. I want to talk about managing subscriptions. The first talk by Mihail was actually really awesome. I like his creative approach to that. But I'm going to talk about a bit more primitive, actually, just relying on basic language JavaScript and TypeScript features to manage your subscriptions. And then I'm going to look at some testing, store, using component factories, and other smaller tricks you can use when you're building large applications. So generally, this presentation is something about things you run into when you build a lot of Angular components, large applications, and you know, it's something that's usually not covered in the guide or in tutorials. It's something you stumble into across time, and you need to figure your own way around it. So the first slide is about managing subscriptions. Who has seen sort of code like this in their components? Well, not too many, but yeah, that happens. One might argue that this is a bit of a like code smell. If you're having so many subscriptions in your component, probably you should break it apart and have better separation of concerns. But nevertheless, it can happen maybe in some high order components. And for me, I'm getting annoyed by this sort of code even when there's 4 subscriptions in one component. And that's actually very realistic because router, you have to subscribe to route, so that's one subscription. You might get 1 or 2 segments from the store in your component. And if you want to do some listening on DOM events, you also create an observable around that. And then you get a few more subscriptions. And so it's nothing far-fetched. And you get all these lines. You have to initiate a property. Then you need to assign the subscription. And, of course, you need to unsubscribe, which is obviously a must-do. And there's no way around it, because RxJS couldn't have made differently, because the client who consumes the library has to subscribe and unsubscribe, so we must do it somehow. But I'm personally really annoyed with this, so many lines just for this pure concept, because subscription is something you need only for the brief moment of the component's lifecycle. You don't do anything else with it. You just need to subscribe, and at some moment unsubscribe. Maybe sometimes earlier in specific cases, but mostly just when the component gets destroyed. Not sure if a lot of people know, but actually there's an add method to your subscriptions. So if you create a subscription, let's say you have 1 master subscription, you can keep adding a child subscription. So, and when you unsubscribe the master subscription, the child also get unsubscribed. That will be one way to manage with the sort of built-in features of the RxJS library. So the code would look like you would initiate one class. By the way, is the code big enough? Unfortunately, I cannot make it bigger because it's already in a slide, because I was sitting in the first or second row and had trouble reading code myself. But the principle is that, yeah, you would have 1 property on the class, it would be your master subscription. Then on destroy, you would have to just unsubscribe that subscription. However, what I also don't like, that you have to create a variable for every subscription and then do another line to specifically add that subscription to your master subscription. But that's probably a way the library sort of has intended for us to use. However, after a while, I figured out a more primitive way to manage subscriptions. So who can raise their hand if you can see the code well? Okay, I'm sure it's okay. I won't be talking just thin air. Perfect. I'm very relieved about that. So, that goes to... yeah. So one way would be to rely on just TypeScript and JavaScript features, because you can create object and you can strictly type it saying that the key will be string, whatever name you give, and value will be subscription. In that case, you won't be able to assign anything else in that object. And you, of course, initiate it with an empty object. And when you do subscribe, you just assign the subscription to a new property in this object. So you just have to do one line per subscription. I really like that. I hate writing too many lines. And on destroy, you can just pass in all the values. So you get an array of all the subscriptions. You pass into this serial unsubscriber. We'll go into that a bit later. But basically what you achieve is less lines of code. Still, it's manageable to read. And I personally like it because one line per subscription. And the great feature, of course, is if you use TypeScript, it sees that the typing you have assigned to the subscriptions and even offers code completion if you ever encounter it in your code. And yeah, for the unsubscriber, there's some utility function somewhere in your code you can reuse throughout components, and it just simply gets the structures, whatever you pass in as an array, goes all over them, makes sure that they are actually subscriptions, and they have the unsubscribe function, and then unsubscribes. So that's one thing I found it convenient to manage subscriptions, because by the time you have like 100 components and at least 20 in your code base are sophisticated and need a lot of subscriptions, you get tired of having write so many lines of code just for pure management of it. So this was something that made the code shorter. Another approach I was contemplating was maybe using decorators, but that seemed a bit too magic, and maybe for some other colleagues who are mainly working backend, it would be too magic to work with that and be too confusing. So this is a bit more, you can sort of follow, click through, and see what is actually happening there. So that's about that. But I did like Michael's approach. I'm actually going to look into that. It seemed also a cool way. How you can manage complexity. All right. So takeaway: managing subscriptions does not need to be verbose. You can make it terse, and it still I think is pretty understandable. So next, I'll talk about testing. There's not much discussion why testing is important. Plenty of reasons, right? We do have to write unit tests. For me, I like it because it helps your factoring a lot, because when you have a large code base, very often some requirements change and you want to move things around, make some things different. Testing helps you to see what broke, and you sort of can see, hey, did I expect this test to break, or did I break something I was not intending to? And yeah, you can find bugs earlier. It helps with debugging. You can find, let's say, at which commit your test start to fail, so when you introduce something different. So there's not an argument about that. However, one thing in Angular, probably also in other frameworks, I really don't like mocking what you're testing, because you don't want to test your components with your real dependencies. And sometimes the real dependencies involve network or state updating. So I really don't like mocking, because writing unit tests in itself, of course, is a, well, let's not call it burden, but it's an effort. It takes a substantial amount of feature time. And if you have to write your mocks along with that, that starts getting burdensome. However, even Angular guide is suggesting mocking is, you have to mock your service. You have to sort of match the signature your actual dependency uses and try to use that. That's doable. That's doable. However, when you have a sophisticated service of dependency or some third-party dependency, it becomes cumbersome very fast. And a lot of these third-party libraries don't provide mocking suit along with their library. And of course, I can understand why not. So this is actually very realistic code. This is actually from production code. Who here uses Angular Material? Also a sizable crowd. So you know it has a lot of supplementary library sort of features and components. One thing is icon registry. If I want to use my own font icons with its material icon, then I need to register them. I need to register font awesome usage. I need to register all the specific SVGs I'm going to use in Codebase, and this is the way to be done. This is also what the documentation shows, and nothing wrong with it. But what if I want to test my app module? What if there's more code in it, which I also want to test? Because let's be honest, okay, you can fairly trust that this is doing what it's intended. Maybe you don't need a test around it, but what if you're sort of really striving for super coverage and you want to test everything you have? So how do you write a test for this? Well, yeah, you can create your own mock for both dependencies, try to inject them, then start filling in what kind of signature they need to match what they need to do. And next thing, you need 33 properties or methods on it to satisfy TypeScript compiler. Okay, you could do this. You can just say TypeScript, hey, trust me, I know what I'm doing. Treat this as if it's the real thing, and it will shut up and won't bother you. But with this, you lose a lot of things. How do you sort of check if the right method was called? How do you capture some arguments? How do you specify what to return in each cases for every specific test case? So here where comes TS Mockito. That's a really great discovery I came across when I was trying to write my tests. Who here has used it? It's not really popular, but it's awesome. I really love it because the built-in Angular testing tool sometimes seems too verbose, and this is super. I'll show you some more examples. So it's actually inspired by Mockito, which is built for Java. Therefore, this is TS Mockito, which is, I think, a cool name. I like it. And it has plenty of features. You can mock behavior, you can return, you can throw, you can capture things. So I'm not going to go in too much depth, just some examples. So it's super easy to use. What you just need to do is whatever you want to wrap, mock, you import the real thing and wrap it in a mocker mock function, which is, of course, mock comes from TS Mockito, and then you export them. I try to keep all these mocks in one file somewhere in my application test folder, so then all the tests can just import this specific mock. And using in your test case is just simple using a value instead of the real thing. However, you need to remember to add a reset after each test is being run, in case you're doing something with your mock and needs to reset its state. Otherwise, test state will leak into other tests and leads to a whole range of other problems. And yeah, it has you can specify, like you can see the second and third line says, yeah, when that particular method is called on the mocked object, yeah, do this, return an observable of nothing in this case. But yeah, that method has to return observable, otherwise the whole thing breaks. You can also verify how many times something was called. You can capture and match what was called, so you can write really good tests with it. You can do a lot with SpyOn, which is built in Angular Suite, which is also a great tool. I have a few slides about that. But I really prefer mocking with TS Mockito. It's made my life so much easier, and I recommend you to try it because it has a great simple API and has saved me so many hours writing your mocks from scratch and adding all the methods on it just by wrapping it in a mock function. So it's awesome. And yeah, in this case, which I showed, the sort of setting the test would be just simple, just pass in an instance of the mocked thing, and the first line you need to specify, okay, when that particular method gets called with any string as a first argument and anything, second argument, then please return an empty observable so it doesn't break. So yeah, this is a slide about spying with the built-in SpyOn method. You can actually, what you can do, I don't know if it was a new discovery for me like half a year ago. You can actually spy on module imports and return something else. So if you want to test your component, how it works in different environments based on environmental variables, you can do that. In one specific case, you can say, hey, the environment you import from the environment's key has to be different in this case, and then you can test your code much better. Same thing goes for some third-party library, whatever it is. You can import everything from some library in one variable, and then just spy on the property, and when something gets called on it, just return your own mock. It's also very, if you're really striving for high unit line coverage, this this is how you can tap into some third-party libraries and return, because this is only needed when your dependency is not using Angular dependency injection, so you cannot easily replace what is being injected, so this is one way to do it. And this is not only for testing, but this is something I learned the hard way. Sometimes you have using some library. In this case, I was using a charting library called HighCharts, but it could apply for many other third-party libraries. And a lot of them, sometimes you have to pass in config to whatever you want to use. In this case, I needed to specify all the access config, how the date time is implemented, etc. So configuration of object was huge. One way you could do it is you can start as a property on your class, which uses the instance of the chart. However, yeah, it was so long that I preferred to keep it in a separate file. However, in this case, what happened, when I had multiple components on the screen, turns out that the library was taking this object, configuration object, and sharing it internally, because it was just not copying it, it was just assigning a reference and adding new stuff to it. So what happened was charts from multiple instances started intervening with another. Yeah, this is really a case for why mutability is bad. You should strive to always do immutable stuff, but sometimes the libraries you consume do what they do. And how I came across this was, I had this mysterious situation where my tests started to fail only when they were run one after another. If I run each test separately, yeah, they would pass. So I started searching for all the reasons why would that happen, until I came across that, yeah, that library took this configuration object, put it to sign property, and started doing stuff with it, adding new features, adding new data, and they were intervening between test cases. So what I learned the hard way, always, even if you know maybe something is immutable, instead of giving something just a configuration object, which it can refer to, give it a result of a function which returned configuration object. So you always returned a new fresh instance, and it will not spill over to other cases. So that's one very practical lesson learned hard way. But it was fun. So takeaways from this section, mocking can be greatly simplified by using TS Mockito. You can do spying on module imports in ES6. So write you more better covered tests. And when you pass in configuration objects, I suggest you use functional returns, not just plain objects. All right, next, using store. I guess most people have heard of one of the libraries here. Who here has used NGRX? Quite sizable crowd. And NGXS? A lot less. What would I expect? And Akita? Yeah, I haven't used Akita yet. What I know about NGRX, it's really verbose, and there's a lot of boilerplate. It's a great library, a lot of great features, and when you write a sophisticated application, it's really invaluable. However, after a while, you start getting tired of writing all these effects modules and all the reducers when you have similar entities, but you still have to write separate lines of code for that. Here comes NGXS, also was a discovery, my latest project. I'm really happy with it because I believe XS stands for extra small and allows you to manage state much more simply and in fewer lines. And I'm not gonna go in too much detail about this. By the way, in this slide, I don't know if you can read the bottom slide. Sorry, bottom line. It's a bit gray, but there's a great article which compares all these three. So if you're thinking which one to choose for your next project, you might want to read it. Because again, I always sort of profess right tool for the right job, but I don't know. I don't think there's one always better. Depends on the context and the circumstances. But I've been very, very happy with my choice of NGXS. So I'll briefly talk about it. It has a lot less boilerplate. It gives you snapshot selection, which NGRX doesn't. And snapshot selection is something that gives you the current state of the store right away, synchronously, like just an object. You because usually you subscribe to a segment of the store and then you get updates whenever it changes, you receive a new event. However, in some circumstances, you just need to get whatever is in the store right now. For example, when you're in the route guards, for example, if you want to check if the user is authenticated or what the user ID currently in the store, you don't want to couple that with also getting an observable, unpacking it, and seeing what the value. Just get the snapshot right away. What's in there. There are some scenarios where that's preferable and useful. And it has official plugin for online persistent, that is storing things in session storage or local storage. It can sync with your reactive forms in Angular, and it also has good integration with WebSockets. I haven't tried it, but sounds promising. Those are all. There are a lot of other features which both NGRX and NGXS share. Didn't mention those, but these three are unique to NGXS in the sense that it's first-class sort of support. NGRX might have also support, but from sort of third-party plugin writers. So using NGXS is super simple. Basically, you need to decorate your app state class with a couple of configuration options, giving it a name so you know how to refer to it, passing it some defaults. Basically, that's the shape of the app state model. So whatever app state model is an interface. It's basically describing the shape of your state, what kind of data will be in, and this super simple example with user and articles, which is an array. And it's sufficient for defaults because it initiates with the empty array. So, and in your app state body, you would just add selectors. Selectors are sort of like memoized selectors, something you can refer to in your components later on just to get that particular sort of segment of the store. And then you can write actions, sort of like reducers in a way, but basically when you dispatch an action on the store, what happens? So in this case, when you would dispatch action called get articles, it would get articles from the API, then you would tap into it, and you would dispatch another action that would patch your store. So there's a lot more what you can do with this library, but it's not the topic of this talk, so I'm going to skip it over. And in your component, you just do, if you want to subscribe to a memoized selector, like we wrote the selector for user, now we can just get it in component by using select decorator, specifying which property key on our state it is, and it's done. And then in your template, you get user, which is an observable, so you still have to do async pipe on it, or you can later on in your code, you can also subscribe on it or do anything you do with observables. And if you want to issue dispatch actions, this is how you would do it. You would just, of course, you would get the store in your constructor, you would inject it, etc. But yeah, just dispatch action you want to do. And also it's possible to select arbitrary segments of your state just by passing a callback into it. So you can also filter out some actions, and you can do a lot of more things. So the takeaway of this is what I want to say is that, the store doesn't have to be verbose. You can do a lot, and it's really helpful and allows you to write less code. One thing I also learned is that actually it's preferential to update store in one go, at least in my case it's been, because at the beginning I thought, okay, I'm going to have an action for getting articles when that's done, because that's responsible just for contacting the API, and when it's done, they're going to do another action, then I'm going to update store actually. Thought, okay, in that fashion, I'll be able to debug better. I will see where my problems occur, if there are any. So let's separate those stages. However, in months of practice, I realized that I never had run into any problem due to actions being sort of incomprehensible or hard, and I was just writing too many lines for this for something that could be done in one action. So might not apply to every scenario, but in my case, it's been always simpler to do everything in one go. The exception is when you have something in your state that can update, when you can reuse the same sort of action. For example, you can get articles both from a REST call, which is initiated by some component, but perhaps there's also maybe some WebSocket connection which gets a new update, and then you also need to update the store, then you can reuse it, then you can split the get and got actions separately. So takeaways, Nginx, this is a easy library, really small boilerplate, and single action for getting data and updating stores, usually better in most cases. So still have some time. One thing that's also useful, try to use component factories sometimes, if it makes sense. For example, in large applications, there's always some settings part. For example, let's say you have a part where you have many tabs, and every tab can have different panels. Let's say you want to set up how the application treats units. Are they metric, imperial? Are the graphs with 2-axis, single axis, etc.? So many configuration options. So the standard streamlined way in Angular would be you write a specific template for every tab. This is the view. These are the components in it. But very early on I realized, no, I'm too lazy for that, and I hate being repetitive. So let's try to do it dynamic way. You can just set up your configuration object, which is basically object with key value pairs, where key is the name for whatever tab it would be, and the array values are configuration options for every panel. By the way, who here has used component factory before? Just a quick survey. That's some handful of people, not too many. So what you can do then is just iterate over those configuration configs. You need a wrapper component which takes it all in. Then you can pass it in as an input. And in that component, what you would need to assign is ng template with a child name. And in the component, I don't expect anyone to remember this, but yeah, you can look it up online. There's plenty of resources. I just want to show this as an example. This is something you can do really easily. You can dynamically render components on the screen, so you don't have to write your templates explicitly for this view. For this view, when you have a lot of repetitive components where there's a lot of shared functionality, you can use this approach with component factories. Okay. I'm nearing the end of my talk with time, so I'll skip ahead. So takeaway is component factory can aid dynamic composition of views, so you don't have to write everything in templates. That's a good thing. And then I have some smaller tricks I want to mention. So sometimes you want to do delays in your data, actually, because who would have thought? Because maybe we want to get data, we want to get something from the store as soon as it's there. However, when you have a sophisticated dashboard with a lot of panels on screen and which are configurable by users, so a user might have anything from 1 panel to 20. Getting all the data at once, from even if it's in store, it's actually very detrimental to performance, because upon the route view, Angular will get all the data and try to put all the DOM nodes on the screen, and that is slow. So, just a small trick, you can add a delay, debounce or delay in your data flow just for 10 milliseconds, and that helps a lot. Then you can flip a Boolean when the data arrives, and in your template, of course, you have some small hidden or ngIf when you animate when the data comes in, and that greatly speeds the perceived performance of the application, because route change happens immediately, all the components load, and only then the data in them start loading. It's something with the lazy loading, but this is a hello, sneaky. So yeah, that's a small trick, sometimes useful just to delay your data a bit, good for the UI. One small trick was with dynamic string translations in Angular, because Angular 2+ does a translation with the I18N attribute, so then you can generate your translation files. It doesn't offer you out of the box dynamic string translation. For example, what if I have a variable which can be, in this super simple case, it's two options. It can be either metric or imperial, and I want to have corresponding string in the language the app is writing in. But yeah, the app users are using different locales. We have Dutch version, we have believe Chinese version, etc., etc. So how do you do that if you want something dynamic be translatable? So this is one way to do it. You can have a wrapper component, which pure responsibility is to have a conditional template string generation, because then you can use attributes to pass those strings to the language translation file, and your strings can be translated dynamically. Right, moving on. Another small trick. I really don't like relative imports. However, VS Code often, when you auto-import something, often does the import with relative paths, which really troublesome when you move something around later, when you decide to move this component to a different module, or make it a level deeper or level higher. All these relative imports break apart. It's so confusing. You cannot do it in one go because everything is relative. However, there's a great feature in TypeScript. In just your tsconfig, you can provide alias paths, so you can have your own whatever kind of string and to whatever arbitrary location in your code, and then in your component you just import based on that sort of absolute location. And then refactoring becomes super easy. If you move something around to a new location, you just have to search replace throughout your code base one string, and it's done. Yeah, it's super easily. So that's another small trick I learned. And I think with this, yeah, we're through. So the key takeaways from my talk: subscriptions doesn't have to be verbose. You can do them simpler. There was one primitive way with language features. Mocking, try TS Mockito, super convenient, been very, very helpful. Try using functional returns for your config objects. Look into NGXS if you're looking for an easy way to manage store without too much verbosity. And yeah, you can also look into Components Factory. Sometimes it's useful if you have a lot of dynamic components. You don't want to write your templates out. And that's the last slide. And yeah, you can find me at this email. Hope you can read it. It's a bit dim. I am harais.dev. And thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Harais.